Blood Money. Article by Anna von Reitz. Part 19. Additional issues for the International Court of Justice. Bank fraud. Not only have the so-called individual accounts never been balanced and the credit made available, not even to pay public debts for the actual creditors, but bank operations have been deregulated and left without oversight to such an alarming degree that the entire industry is detached from reality, literally. The mutually assured destruction, quid pro quo, and bank labor function distribution routed through the Octagon Group Holding Company is a nightmare, and no matter how fast they spin the hamster wheel or how many hamsters are added to it, the basic problems simply remain and get bigger. Both the insurance industry and the practice of fractional reserve banking, which allows the banks to loan out 7 to 10 times the amount that they are holding as capitalization, represent legalized gambling. The insurance racket plays the probabilities of an event happening, and with the banks, that event is the probability of depositors all wanting their deposits back on any given day. A bank run, or simply having a margin crisis, which is a limited bank run, that forces them to borrow short-term funding from other banks. As the banks are all bankrupt entities themselves, they have no motivation not to gamble. They can't be held accountable. Even if there is a bank run by depositors and the banks are left with both pockets turned inside out, they can shrug and say, "We've been bankrupt since 1933. What do you expect us to do about it?" They are bulletproof against any claim a depositor can make, and they know this. So they have no motive to protect depositors, and depositors are left with the ugly demand, "You want bank services or not?" The initial problem, the overextension of credit far beyond the assets of the bank, becomes compounded as the banks seek to leverage their interest margins on each loan transaction and spin the wheel faster, faster, faster. It's oddly like the difference between simple interest and compound interest. The banks increase the number of loans and the speed of the loan transactions too, in effect, extract more interest and do it faster and more efficiently. Interest accruals that used to be collected by the end of each day are now collected by the second. The AI system that makes this possible doesn't evaluate the transactions. It simply aims to maximize the loan deposits and the interest accruing to the deposits, because the interest on deposits is the bank's funding. Many Americans don't know that Congress is loaning every cent to the banks to fund every loan, and Congress is extracting the funds from us to do it. They are literally loaning us our own money and then charging us interest on it. And if that is not a con game, what is? When the bank approves a home loan for $300,000, they go to the Federal Reserve and request it to deposit the whole amount of the loan, which it does. The Federal Reserve in turn goes to Congress and requests Congress to deposit the amount that they just extended to the bank. Congress goes to your trust funds and extracts the entire amount of the loan from your assets, then makes the banks responsible for collecting it back, plus interest. The banks and their insurance companies do so with great gusto, as evidenced by the millions of foreclosures and cruel evictions that happen every year. The banks have nothing to lose with respect to depositors, thanks to the perpetual bankruptcy scheme, but the Federal Reserve can shut them down, and so can their insurance companies. Those two masters have to be served. Forget any regard for the depositors who are actually the people funding this whole bizarre charade, the living people who are the funders and employers of the banks, the Federal Reserve, the Congress, and the fund managers busily investing our assets for us. In all typical foreclosure cases, the bank is foreclosing on the actual source of the funding it loaned. The bank owes the Federal Reserve owes the Congress, and the Congress owes the borrower for this loan. Congress doesn't recognize us as the source of all that yummy prepaid credit, because they long ago deliberately misidentified us as U.S. citizens and reported that we were lost at sea presumed dead as Americans, and it is as Americans that we inherit everything. The entire situation with the banks and the Congress reads like a grade B movie script, where the heirs of a large estate are bundled up by their disloyal house servants, put in a leaky boat, and set sail on the tide, while the duplicitous servants report them missing and themselves left standing as the only apparent heirs to the castle. The solutions require common sense and very little else. The solution: bankrupt banks must not be allowed to continue their operations. They have to be liquidated and turned over to new, hopefully more honest and adept management. Depositors' interests must be honored and protected. Also, strict new banking regulations and oversight mechanisms must be put in place. Unlawful securitization and monetization of labor must cease, and all those bonds must be discharged and settled. The banks and insurance companies must then be held feet first to the fire and used to backflush Congress to force the recognition of the actual funders of all these loan transactions, the American people, who have been deliberately misidentified as the borrowers instead of the creditors in fact. You will remember from the discussion about my account, my municipal person owed $50 million worth of debt in the form of EE Series Federal Reserve notes. But my long-lost American person, a Sesta Trust, was owed over $12 billion in prepaid credit, socked away in trust funds, which I can't access because I have been deliberately misidentified and miscategorized and impersonated by the same persons benefiting themselves from the misuse and abuse of my assets, my own employees, and the members of Congress purportedly representing me. Shall we make it perfectly clear that these jokers do not represent me? Nor do they legitimately represent millions upon millions of other Americans whose assets they have similarly commandeered and cashiered in gross breach of trust, under color of law, under conditions of non-disclosure, semantic deceit, and constructive fraud. And this has all been done by people who are taking their paychecks from our pockets. This has been done at the direction of all the popes since 1860, all the British monarchs since 1860, and all the Lord Mayors of London since 1860. It must also be admitted that this gross abuse could not have occurred without the agreement and cooperation of the members of the territorial U.S. Congress and members of the Municipal Congress. They have used America as a resource dump, as a source of cheap mercenaries, and as a giant slush fund for their immoral, unlawful, and illegal activities here and throughout the world. Putting a definitive end to this situation would certainly help the actual Americans, but it would be of great benefit to the entire rest of the world too, because these same criminal political elements, the banks and attorneys allied with them, and the insurance corporations that back them, have sought to engender perpetual war for profit throughout the entire planet. Even now, they are scuffing around trying to get something started. For everyone's security and safety on a worldwide basis, these perpetrators must be exposed together with the criminal mechanisms that they have used to secure these results. These abuses must be stopped in America and not allowed to renew and self-perpetuate again in China. This ancient source of war, chaos, and disruption must be recognized for what it is, a profane and idolatrous religion devoted to deceit, mammon, and death. It shall not pass.